Welcome back to another episode of Investing Explained. Here's today's question. It's hard to disagree with Ray Dalio when you read through his write-ups and see how well-researched it is. And I think that where he really does a good job is to zoom out and look at the rise and fall of empires throughout centuries. Because I think one of the mistakes that people make is that they think in terms of headlines and what they read right now about China. And they might mistakenly think that big changes are happening tomorrow. What Dalio actually finds is that whenever you have an empire, and an empire in this case could be the United States, it typically lasts 250 years before it's replaced, but it easily be 150 years shorter or longer, at least historically. Now, I still see the US as being the dominant country for decades to come, and perhaps longer. But I also don't think you should underestimate the historical evidence that Ray Dalio outlines for why we see that China will eventually rise and the US fall. One example that Dalio brings up is the Dutch, going back 250 years. And even though there was only between 1 and 2 million people, they actually invented the very first global reserve currency, the Dutch guilder, who accounted for a third of all international transactions. Now, as the power declined and the British slowly took over, they became deeply indebted. The Dutch overspent. They had a lot of domestic problems, including social unrest due to inequality. They had political fractions not willing to compromise, and they also have significant disagreements between the provinces. And as a reaction to the English gaining more military and political power, they also started several trade wars. And I don't know if you think that sounds familiar of what you're seeing today. But transitioning from one empire to the next does not necessarily happen fast, but where it can happen fast is if you see a war. And that was how the British became the unrivaled world power right after fighting first the Dutch and then later the French in 1815. And you could also make the comparison to that was how the US swiftly took over from the British after World War I, even though they didn't even fight each other. And we've historically seen wars 75% of the time when one empire rose and another one fell. Now, I don't want to say that unless there is a major war, that we won't see any significant changes. So, what happens whenever we look into the future? What kind of significant changes can we expect? Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that some of the rules have changed. The gains and losses of going to war has changed. For instance, you're not going to war to get the enemy's gold and silver. Today, the riches of a country look very different, and it can't be stolen or won, if you like, the same way. And it's also politically much harder to go to war in a democracy than if you were a kingdom or a dictatorship. So today you have nuclear, you have cyber attack as an act of war. So it might look very different warfare than whenever you look back in history. Now, we could almost do an entire episode about this, and we might eventually do that, but going back to your question about investing. Yes, I do invest in China. And right now, that's around 12% of my stock portfolio. I have some through an emerging market ETF where China accounts for 44%, but the majority of my exposure is through Alibaba. This is a stock that I pitched in Q1 2019 at the Mastermind meeting, and I'm seriously just going to say that it's been up more than 35% since then. And you can hear much more about my reasons why I want to invest in that company by going back and listening to the episode. But a position like that is not so much influenced by China is going to be the new empire. It's going to be the most dominant country in the world. There are so many other factors much more important going into a decision like that. Now, I just wanted to mention one more thing. Whenever you talk about it being a major handicap that countries and the governments across the globe not trusting the Chinese, now I agree that there's a mistrust, but from an investor perspective, I'm not sure it makes much of a difference. And please forgive me for going back here in the history books, but going all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, US have had a major influence in South America. And despite of the lack of trust in the US government through time, it hasn't really changed the ultimate income of how those markets have been developed. Going back to the US overtaking UK's place as the world's dominant superpower, the lack of trust throughout the world also really stood out. And just like we've seen historically, China is also using soft powers to gain influence. Now, while the US still dominates in South America, we've seen in Asia how Asian nations have formed alliances with the Chinese instead of the US. That's not just through One Belt, One Road that connects 70 countries and is controlled by the Chinese, but Chinese companies in some countries even have privileges that national companies do not. And we've seen in Europe how the Chinese are buying more and more influence and insist on trading bilateral with EU countries instead of the entire bloc. And that clearly gives a lot of power to the Chinese. Europe, as a bloc, actually has a bigger economy than China, but as they insist on negotiating with each single country, the situation obviously looks very different. The EU has not been good enough in terms of sticking together in those negotiations. Most noticeable, you have seen in Africa that was historically heavily influenced by Europeans, that the Chinese are closely working with multiple governments. And if you're interested specifically in that, I can highly recommend a book called China's Second Continent, written by Howard French. I read it 3 times already, and I can only recommend that you read it at least once. But before dragging on too much, I'm not saying that China's influence is not concerning, and that you're not right whenever you say that there's a problem with mistrust in the Chinese government. But with power always comes mistrust, and this time is just not different.
I look at this first from, why is Ray Dalio talking about this, and what kind of self-interest does he maybe have? And I think this is an important point to kind of think about. So Ray's firm, Bridgewater, 160 billion assets under management, opened up a China unit in 2016. And I think whenever a company like Bridgewater is looking at capturing more investors and to manage other people's money, and they look at the Chinese market and how massive it is, I think he has an interest in order to capture some of those funds and play nice with the Chinese government, which anyone who wants to do business in China has to do, which really kind of gets at your point. Can that be trusted if people have to placate to the Chinese government opposed to saying what they actually think? Now, how much of this conflict of interest that I'm bringing up plays into Ray Dalio personally or Bridgewater as a company, I have no idea. How much their research is suggesting China is going to be a powerhouse versus how much they have a self-interest in capturing some of those dollars. But I think it's an important point for people to think about anytime they hear Bridgewater or Ray Dalio talk about China. I personally look at the world as, every single country in the world offers an opportunity for your hard-earned dollars to allocate into those countries in order to seek a return for owning a business that performs work in that area and providing products and services in that region of the world. So if it makes you uncomfortable, I'd tell you, don't invest there. To be honest with you personally, I don't really like the antics that the Communist Party that rules China, the way that they play ball. So I don't invest there. That's just my personal preference. Those are some of my thoughts. And I think that when we look at China's role in the next 10 to 20 years, do I think that they're going to be a major player in the economic space? Yeah, I kind of do. But that doesn't mean that I want to put my dollars over there and invest when there's a government that's controlling and dictating. Because just my personal experience, anytime I see manipulation, it always turns out in kind of a bad way. That's just my personal experience. So I avoid situations and I try to avoid markets where I think things are being manipulated. I think that's probably one of the reasons why when you look at my Twitter feed and I'm calling out the Federal Reserve for manipulating interest rates and manipulating the bond market, that's why I'm doing that. Because in my experience, in this short life I've lived, it's always been evident to me that whenever there's manipulation and there's somebody stepping in and tweaking the dials on how things should naturally occur, that there's always a consequence paid for that. So I don't necessarily know what that consequence will be long term. I just don't trust it, and I don't think that it's a place that I want to participate because I just don't know how it's going to resolve itself. So those are some of my thoughts on Ray Dalio specifically, Bridgewater, the Chinese Communist Party, and how they're interacting in their markets and how they're controlling all the data and all those kind of things. They have me concerned, but it doesn't mean that market's not going to perform in the future. So just some things to think about.
That's it. Preston and I will continue explaining investing, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button.